They have been in office for less than a year, all of them women of color. On Sunday, the president took to Twitter, saying the congressman came from, quote, countries whose governments are a complete and total catastrophe. He told them to, quote, go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came. Let's remember this. All four of these congresswomen are U.S. citizens. Mm-hmm. 3 of the 4 were born in the United States, one of which, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, emigrated to the United States when she was 12 years old. Ali Velshi, the president, and we've seen this for months from the conservative media, are trying to single out these women and say they're the face of the Democratic Party. These
women couldn't pay for this PR, I got to tell you.
They hate America, they're anti-American, and saying and painting them as the face of the party. Let's remember, Nancy Pelosi, who's actually the Speaker of the House, she was elected into office in 1987. Think about some of the people who are running for president. Seth Moulton, Pete Buttigieg, both veterans, certainly not anti-American in any way, nor are these 4 women, but it's stunning to see the picture they're painting. You got 20-plus people running for president in the Democratic Party. You think Steve Bullock, the governor of Montana, a red state, is anti-American?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I grew up in a parliamentary democracy, and a lot of countries are that. And the opposition is in these countries, in some of them in the UK and Canada, they're called the loyal opposition. It's considered a real job. Criticism of your country or your government is not meant to be unpatriotic. But this is McCarthyism. The president saying that if you don't like it, you can leave, and they hate America. The idea that you are translating criticism of your government or your country into anti-patriotic behavior or traitorous behavior is not only incorrect, it's not only intellectually small and flexes no muscles, it's really dangerous. Because that's when people start to say, oh, you hate our country. No, I was critical of the country. As a Canadian, I can be critical of Canada. Often I am. As an American, I can be critical of America. I love these countries. Being critical of your country is not evil. It's not unpatriotic. It's democracy. But for the president to elevate, to your point, the PR or the profiles incorrectly of these 4 individuals, but to elevate them in a way, these women who we're looking at haven't held their positions for even a year. And it's stunning to me that we're seeing this happen. We do have 4 Republicans, by the way, who have condemned Donald Trump for his attacks. Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. 4 out of, hold on, 280 plus. Remember, Lindsey Graham in 2015 called the president xenophobic and a bigot. And today, Lindsey Graham on Fox News doubling down on the president, attacking these women, saying aim higher. If they're the face of the Democratic Party, I'm not sure what Lindsey Graham's talking about. So 4 Republicans have so far come out and said, and we'll keep a track of who's coming out and saying this, but this stuff, well, the president was asked very specifically, by the way, by a reporter, are you concerned about the fact that white nationalists are now aligning with the president's comments? He says, it doesn't concern me because many people agree with me. So this is, in covering all of this, the way we've covered it in the last 2.5 years, this actually feels different to me. This feels like the president really owning the idea that he's saying things that are attractive to white nationalists and racists. But then I would ask you, Ali, when you're calling for members of the GOP to stand up and speak out against the president, why do you think they would? For the last decade, they haven't when it came to birtherism. Very few did when the president went after what he called S-hole countries. So to a Mexican judge, rapists and murderers. So to expect something different now, I'm not 100% sure why you do that. All right. There is a simmering discussion that sort of set the president off between these 4 women, these 4 freshman members of Congress, and Nancy Pelosi. It almost seems quaint now. But joining us to talk about that is New York Magazine contributing writer Robert Draper and NBC News chief White House correspondent Hallie Jackson. Welcome to both of you. Hallie, what set the president off down this road of criticizing these 4 congressmen? Mostly, if you've been talking about these 4 women, we've been talking about it in the context of an argument that they've been in with Nancy Pelosi for the last couple of weeks.
Let me see if I can do a little bit of a timeline here, Allie, and work backwards as well from the president now just leaving. And I've been watching the live feed that the White House has put out of that event, that remarkable event over on the other side of the White House from where I am, the South Lawn. The president is now back inside. I was watching to see if he would take more questions because that was not expected. We didn't think he was going to be stopping and taking shouted questions from reporters from a distance there at that Made in America product showcase. Let's flash back, though, to this weekend. And we can't say for sure, but what we can say is this, that around the time that the president tweeted, just before that, one of the cable networks had been having a discussion, it seems, about this divide inside the Democratic Party. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the other three members of the squad, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. That may have been what set the president off initially in that tweet. He referenced Nancy Pelosi, seemed to be trying to exploit the divide there. Of course, one of the things that it has done, that tweet when the president told those members of Congress, some Democrats, as he put it, to go back to their home countries, only served to unify them more, because now you are seeing a Democratic Party that is not talking about the infighting between Pelosi and Ocasio-Cortez and others, but is instead very angry with President Trump, almost unanimously, as far as I've seen, united in their opposition to what he has said. That sets the stage for today. Let me do one thing here and add another Republican to your list, because as we were on the air, Senator Susan Collins, who is, of course, one of the more moderate Republican members, has come out now and said that she believes that the president's comments were over the line, emphasizing that she does disagree with some of the policies put forward by these four freshman lawmakers on the other side of the aisle, but disparaging the president's remarks about them. That brings us up to this moment now. The president, boy, did he want to talk. And boy, did he want to talk about this specifically. He has been getting a lot of intense coverage over these last 24 hours or so for that tweet, given the concerns that it is racist, that it is just seen as a racist trope. His own administration officials are denying that, defending the president, as are some of his Republican allies, like, for example, Senator Lindsey Graham. While he does say the president should aim higher, he did agree with some of the criticism of the president as it related to the policies of these lawmakers. Then you had this, what you could only call impromptu news conference, semi-news conference here on the South Lawn. Again, this was an event meant to talk about manufacturing gains, meant to bring together various small and big businesses to show off products that are, as the president puts it, made in America. He stopped and spoke with a group of reporters, including our own Kelly O'Donnell, who I think is running back from the South Lawn now, who asked the president, isn't he above this? Shouldn't he be above this? It's a question that the president ignored. He then got to the podium and very clearly knew that people wanted to take questions about it, because he did something he doesn't always do. But he stopped his remarks and then he said, does anybody have any questions on the manufacturing piece of it? And turned to the press to invite them to ask questions. I've been in these moments in the Oval Office dozens of times, Allie and Steph. The president doesn't do that unless he really wants you to ask him about the story of the day. And he seemed to really want people to ask him about the story of the day. And of course, our colleagues out there on the South Lawn did. What was notable to me, Allie, is what you picked up on. The president directly asked several times by a questioner from Fox News whether the president was concerned that many people find these tweets racist and that white supremacists are finding common cause with the president. The president very clearly said he was not concerned because he believes that many people agree with him. He is, I mean, pick your sort of cliched adjective here, digging in, doubling down on defense. They all apply to what the president's position and stance is now. Perhaps not surprising if you've watched the president. He is not a person who has backed down very frequently over the course of the years that I've been covering him as a candidate and now as president. And he is very clearly not doing that now. Here's what we're watching for next. Now that we've seen the president on camera, we've seen reaction from these lawmakers. Where is Senate and House leadership on this? Not just on the Democratic side of the aisle with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, I believe set to return to Washington later on this afternoon. Senator Mitch McConnell, Leader Kevin McCarthy, a very close ally of Donald Trump's. How will they respond here? That is one of the things that we'll be watching for. I'll leave it to you guys to make your own guesses on that. But it is, from a reporting standpoint, one of the puzzle pieces that is left unfinished here.
Robert, you wrote in an article in November that Pelosi would have to navigate between a quote, rampaging president and her colleagues' plans for fighting back. I'm kind of curious, because when we wanted to talk to you, it was because Nancy Pelosi and the squad were going at it. As I said at the top of this thing, it almost seems like a quaint battle right now. What do you think Nancy Pelosi makes of it? They got Trump, yeah, literally. What do you think Nancy Pelosi is making of what's going on right now, and how does she respond to it? Because obviously she is going to come to the defense of her four colleagues in the caucus.
Yeah, well, I actually think the end game for the Trump administration and the Trump campaign isn't to divide the Democrats so much as to unify them, but to unify them to the left of where Pelosi wants to be. And I think from Trump's perspective, he achieved that in this particular case. For Nancy Pelosi to stand up, quite understandably, maybe even laudably, in favor of coming to the defense of the squad, is understandable on the one hand, but on the other hand, from the Trump perspective, means that she is now basically defending the indefensible. Now, we heard Trump saying just a minute ago, many people love my tweets, many people love them. Trump says that over and over, my base loves this, my people loves this. He knows that his base is not enough to get him elected. So what does he do in a re-election year where it's a choice, not a referendum, or at least that's what they're going to try to do? They're going to try to paint the Democrats as socialists, as people to the far right. And so that's what we've been hearing over and over. All of this is basically an attempt by President Trump and later by his surrogates to fashion Democrats as people who are way, way out of step. We will hear this over and over when it comes to Medicare for all, when it comes to any policies basically the Democrats suggest.
Except, Robert, how exactly does that work? Where Nancy Pelosi has come out in defense of the squad, it's about human decency and respect and civility. On this same day, Joe Biden, the Democratic frontrunner, has come out with his health care plan where he's criticizing Medicare for all. So how will the president be successful in unifying the Democratic Party and pushing them to the left when Nancy Pelosi hasn't mentioned anything about policy and Joe Biden has, and it's not left?
Point well taken, and I would actually add to that criticism of things that take place in America hardly means that you're un-American. After all, who was perhaps the most critical person during the Obama administration? Donald Trump. Over and over he talked about how we don't win anymore, we're always losing. He told me on his plane that some of the most dangerous cities in the world are American cities. So Trump knows perfectly well that there is something intellectually fraught with this strategy. That doesn't mean that he's not going to try it.
But Hallie, there's a lot of intellectual fraud stuff going on. The president said this morning, if I would have lost, the stock market would have crashed. When he talked about the records on the stock market, he said you have to start on the day after the election day. I mean, this is to some people this is crazy talk, but to a lot of people this is campaign-y talk. What's going on? Is this a part of a strategy, or is this the president's mind taking control of how he's doing this? Is there a White House strategy? Is there a campaign strategy that says that what Robert is talking about is going to make sense and work for him?
You're directing that to me, right, Allie?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's what I would say is that from the beginning, and it continues to this moment, to this minute, this is a strategy dictated by the president and only the president himself. There are advisors who are giving him advice, who are saying what they think he should do. We know that based on our reporting and based on the sources that we talk to. But ultimately, it is entirely up to the president. It is a small example, but today is evidence of that. In the instance, the president, again, wanted to talk about this, was not supposed to stop and talk to reporters before sort of the setup where all the cameras were, but he did anyway, despite his advisors having moved members of the press away from that area. Again, it's just an indication that this is a president who's going to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And if that means taking questions on the White House South Lawn on a tweet that is being widely slammed as racist, then that is what the president is going to do. You talked about the incorrect claims the president has made. There were multiple in that series of remarks. Broadly speaking, though, big picture, the president is always on the campaign trail, even when he's at the White House. And that is, again, I think some of what you saw on the South Lawn today. The president does have a campaign rally later this week, actually on Wednesday night. I expect you will hear similar language from the president, particularly as it relates to the economy, Allie, an issue that I know you are passionate about and one that the president is as well.
Thank you. Go ahead. Sorry.
But Robert, is it a safe assumption where Hallie says the White House aides are saying that the president is acting alone here? Is he really? If you look at conservative media, you mentioned it before, this push, this narrative that Democrats are pushing to be socialist. Last I checked, of the over 20 people running for the Democratic ticket, only one of them identifies with democratic socialism, and that's Bernie Sanders. I'm pretty sure John Delaney, who once brought a company that he ran public, would never identify as a socialist.
Can I just jump in, Steph? I'm sorry. Before that, I just want to make sure that the reporting is characterized correctly. I don't know that it's that the president is acting alone. It's that he is acting in his own best interests, at times contrary to the advice of his advisors, who, by the way, aren't upset about it. They know that Donald Trump is going to do Donald Trump. They're okay with it. So there is not like there's some concern inside the White House to that perspective. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, and to be clear, this is what Donald Trump does. He fashions himself, he imagines himself as an expert on branding. He will brand Democrats as extremists. Now, you're right, it remains to be seen just how he's going to go about doing this if the nominee is, for example, Joe Biden. He may not talk about socialism anymore. He may talk about old, crazy, lazy, slow-witted, out-of-step Joe Biden. He'll have to come up with something now. But right now, from his perspective, from his point of view, AOC and the others of the squad are handing him a branding gift, the opportunity to paint the Democratic Party as being out of step, and this is what he's going to continue to do. And notice, as Hallie said, I mean, he was supposed to be talking about manufacturing and Made in America. He doesn't want to talk about policy. This is what he wants to do. He wants to campaign, and by way of branding.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.